I have the privilege this morning of speaking on two chapters from Acts, chapters 17 and 18. So I hope you're strapped in for a long session. I'm going to try and just do a quick run through of all that goes on in those two chapters, followed by just picking out a few special points back into it. So the way we finished off last week, Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke had been in Philippi. And at the end of that, Paul and Silas were asked to leave. They left Luke behind, the guy who wrote the gospel, not the guy who sits in our church, to look after the new church in Philippi and to pastor it. So Paul and Silas and Timothy then moved on. They passed through a couple of cities and came to Thessalonica, which at that time was the capital city of Macedonia. And as was the custom, they went into the synagogue there, and over the course of a few weeks, Paul and Silas preached and spoke to the people there to try to convince them that Jesus was the promised Messiah and to believe in him. Some of the people were convinced and believed. Some did not. And those who did not then started to stir up trouble and caused all sorts of issues. And so one night, the believers there got Paul and Silas and Timothy and sent them off to the next town, which was called Berea. When they arrived in Berea, they did exactly the same thing as they'd done in Thessalonica. They went to the synagogue and spoke. But in Berea, the people there, they didn't just outright believe or reject, but they all set themselves to study the scriptures and to see if what Paul and Silas told them was actually true. And as a result, many of them did believe and become Christians. Nevertheless, the unbelieving Jews in Thessalonica heard what was going on, and they sent a delegation to stir up trouble again for Paul. So the Christians in Berea took Paul, and a few of them went with him. They jumped on a boat, and they took him down to Athens. Silas stayed behind with Timothy. And when they got there, they left Paul in Athens, and they headed back home again with a message from Paul to Silas and Timothy to come and join him in Athens as soon as possible. While he waited for them, Paul went into the synagogue and spoke there, and then wandered through the marketplace on a few days and had discussions with the various philosophers that he found there. As a result, they called together a meeting of the Areopagus and took Paul along there and asked him to explain what it is he was talking about. And so in Acts chapter 17, we have a reasonable summary put in there by Luke of what Paul actually spoke on that occasion. And it says that most of them had big trouble with Paul's reference to resurrection, because as everybody knows, when you are dead, you are dead. And so this concept of resurrection just didn't work. Oh, and my apologies, could you put up the map so we can see where we're going? Yep. So Kev said last week that he likes maps. I like maps too. I find they're really helpful to give you a picture of where things are and what's going on. So up north, we got Thessalonica and Berea, where Silas and Timothy still were. Down further south in the grey bit is Athens. And it says there that most of them had trouble with the resurrection in Athens, but a few of them said, look, we'd like to hear more about this. What became of that? We don't know. Luke didn't report it. The next thing we read is that Paul decided to move on to the city of Corinth, which, as you can tell from the map, isn't a huge distance from Athens. At that time, Athens had fallen it had fallen from its former glory and was not the great city that it had once been. In fact, by that time, Alexandria in Egypt was probably the number one city for Greek learning in the world. And Corinth was the capital of the Roman province, that you can see in the grey there. So Paul arrived in Corinth, and when he got there, he found a couple of Jews named Aquila and Priscilla who had recently arrived from Rome. And they were already Christians, and so Paul fell in with them, and they were a big help to him. They could bounce things off each other. They could have Christian fellowship together. And so that was a real blessing to Paul to have them. Now, Aquila was a leather worker. Most of our translations say he was a tent maker. So that would have been a part of it. But he was a bit more wide in what he did working with leather. And it so happens that Pharisees in Judaism, for those who wanted to become a rabbi, they were required to also have a trade so that they could support themselves rather than just sponging off people around about them. And the trade that Paul had picked up, because he was trained to be a rabbi, just happened to be leatherwork and making tents. So they were able to work together, and Paul helped Aquila in his business and made money for himself that way as well to support himself in Corinth. And through the week, he worked with the leather stuff, and on the weekends, he went to the synagogue and spoke about Jesus. Now, that had been going on for a few weeks when Silas and Timothy arrived. Now, they had been told to join Paul in Athens, so I'm not quite sure what discussions they would have had with each other when they arrived in Athens and Paul wasn't even there. Nevertheless, somehow or other, they managed to find their way to Corinth and found Paul. And they brought with them some money because, as we read in the book of Philippians, the Philippian church regularly supplied Paul in his ministry work to enable him to do what he did. And so from that point, Paul was able to stop with the leatherworking and go full-time preaching the gospel. Early on in his time in Corinth, God had spoke to Paul and said, look, you're going to be pretty safe in this place. Stick around for a while. Unlike other places where Paul had to leave in a hurry because he was being attacked. So Paul stayed in Corinth for around about a year and a half. Now, towards the end of that time, a few of the Jews who did not believe decided to kick up, get this frog out in a minute. They decided to kick up a bit of a fuss and make a nuisance of themselves, but it kind of fizzled out and didn't go very far. And Paul stayed a little while longer after that and then decided he wanted to go home back to Judea, to his home church in Antioch. So he set off with Silas and Timothy, and Aquila and Priscilla decided to go as well. They sailed across the sea to the first stop there was Ephesus. And there, Aquila and Priscilla decided to stay. Aquila set up business there in Ephesus once more. Paul dropped into the local synagogue and spoke there, and the people in the synagogue said, hey, stay a while, we'd like to hear more about this. But Paul said, sorry, I've got to go, but if I can, I will come back one day. So Paul and Silas and Timothy headed off back to Caesarea, which is where the ship landed. Then they went up to Jerusalem to give a report to the church in Jerusalem about all that had been done on Paul's and Silas's journey. Now, it is most likely that at that point, Silas stayed in Jerusalem, while Paul and Timothy headed on back to Antioch, which was Paul's home church. The next time we hear anything at all about Silas, he is in Babylon with Peter. And thank you very much, Laura. Paul got back to Antioch and reported to the church there again all that had been done, and he spent some time there. Luke gives no indication, just says some time, so it's probably maybe 6 months or thereabouts, just working in the church and helping out with the church there. But then he decided to head off again, and he went cross-country through what is now Turkey until he eventually arrived in Ephesus. And that is where we finish and where next time starts up in chapter 19. But while Paul was having his time in Antioch, a guy named Apollos, who was from Alexandria in Egypt, he was a Jew and he was a Christian, arrived in Ephesus. He went into the synagogue there and started preaching that Jesus was the Christ and all that sort of thing. But the problem was, what he had been taught, he hadn't been taught properly, and he didn't really understand the gospel properly or the truth properly. So Aquila and Priscilla kind of took him home for lunch and got him to stay at their place while he was in Ephesus, and they explained to him a little bit better what the truth was. So he took that, and a little while after that, he sailed across the sea to Corinth and stayed some time in Corinth, where, to all intents and purposes, he was a real blessing to the church there. So now I need my glasses. Coming back then to Acts chapter 17, verses 1 to 3, it says, "When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbaths he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. 'This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ,' he declared." Now, this here is where Paul gives a bit of a summary of Paul's habits and his basic message and what he did. So other cities that Paul went to, the same thing happened, but it only needed to be described once, and this is the time that Luke describes it. He passed through 2 cities because they did not have synagogues. And he stopped in Thessalonica, which did. And as was his custom, he went first to the synagogue to preach to the Jews. Paul is commonly known as the apostle to the Gentiles, but he always started with the Jews. And there are 2 main reasons for that, I believe. Firstly, as he describes himself in Romans chapter 9, as a Jew himself, he had a real heart for his people and wanted them to come to know truth, to come to know Jesus, to come to know salvation. But also, the Jews, and it wasn't just Jews in all of these cities, there were lots of what they called God-fearers. Now, God-fearers were Greeks or other nationalities who were not Jews, but who nevertheless came to believe in the God of the Jews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the law of Moses. And they attached themselves to the synagogues, they worshipped with the Jews, they listened to the Old Testament scriptures and came to understand them. They just weren't quite prepared enough to go all the way and become proselytes and fully fledged Jews themselves. So we have here Jews and Greeks who already have a foundation in the scriptures, something on which Paul could build without having to start from scratch. And so that was the other reason why he went there first, so that he could build on that to build the church. But as we heard, there was trouble for those who didn't believe, and so he moved on to Berea. And in Acts 17, verses 10 to 12, it says, "As soon as night had fallen, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now, the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if these teachings were true. As a result, many of them believed, along with quite a few prominent Greek women and men." You'll notice up here that I've got my references from the BSB, which stands for Berean Standard Bible. Now, that's not because that was the version that they used in Berea. This is a very recent translation that is called that on the basis of this story about the people in Berea who were more noble-minded, as Luke put it, and who diligently studied the scriptures. And it is my current favourite translation. They studied and researched, and they wanted truth above all else. They were not prepared to allow tradition and personal pride and so on to come between them and the truth. And everywhere else we read in the book of Acts where Paul went, there were always a goodly proportion of the Jews who were prepared to allow tradition and personal pride to come first, with truth delegated after that as not relevant in comparison. But these people were different. It's not easy to have what you have built your life on to be challenged. Not easy to have your life upended, to have to start all over again, to leave behind all that is important to you, as Paul himself knew from personal experience. Now, for this point I'm bringing through here, I've got a few small stories to tell you. That was the first one, and the next one comes in Acts chapter 18, verses 24 to 26, where it says, "Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord and was fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately about Jesus. though he knew only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him in and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now, Apollos is someone that we really don't know a lot about. We read this little snippet about him in Acts, and then there's a little bit more in 1 Corinthians. But from what we have learned about him, we read that he was clearly a man of learning, a man of knowledge, and someone with a powerful speaking presence. And such people tend to have a high level of conceit. They tend to have significant pride, and they certainly don't take well to lesser people correcting them. But Apollos appears to have been an exception. He was humble and teachable and ready to embrace truth, no matter where it came from. Antony Flew was born into a Christian home in the middle of the last century. His father, in fact, was a Baptist minister. And there is one lesson that his father taught him that really stuck with Antony for all of his life. Always follow the evidence wherever it leads. Problem was, as he went through high school, he came to believe that the evidence proved that there is no God. God does not exist. And by the time he got to university, he was a fully fledged atheist. And he became one of the most significant atheists of the second half of the 20th century. He spoke at many of their conferences. He was involved in debates with Christians and others. He wrote a couple of papers that were extremely influential in promoting and pushing atheism. And this went on for quite a few decades until one day he was confronted with some more evidence that convinced him he was wrong. Evidence convinced him that there cannot not be a God, that God truly must and does exist. And so he made that known. Even at the cost of his intellectual and academic legacy, at the cost of his reputation and his relationship with his fellow atheist friends and colleagues, he insisted on following the evidence wherever it leads. And he made known that he had been wrong all of his life. He had been wrong, and that there is a God. When I was younger, I lived with my sister and my parents, and we lived at Wollonga for 10 years. While we were there, I did most of my high schooling and my university studies. And we were members of the local Uniting Church. Now, our church, a number of years while we were there, had a family camp down at Victor Harbour. And I remember one year in particular, I would have been about 19, 20 at the time in university. We had our Saturday morning session. We had a speaker who spoke at that session. And then we divided up into the various groups that we'd been allotted to discuss things. And there was one woman in the group that I was in who would have been probably late 40s, early 50s. And she told us that she didn't want to have to think for herself and work out what to believe. She just believed what her husband told her. Now, her husband was a very good man. He was very worthwhile. He was a strong Christian. He was an elder and a pillar in the church and in the community. So what he would have told her would have been right and good, so she would have been okay that way. But what if he wasn't like that? What if he was totally different? She'd have believed all the wrong things. And for that matter, a couple of years prior to this, he had suddenly died, which was a great shock to everyone. He just had a heart attack and died. And so she'd been a widow for a couple of years. Now what? And I can clearly remember at the time, I was horrified. And I'm still horrified that she just refused to think for herself, just believed what she was told to believe. How many Christians actually know what they believe and why? How many could be easily diverted from the truth by any believable or attractive lie, as Paul himself speaks about in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. It is vital for all of us to study the Bible, to study daily, like the Bereans. Now, as it turns out, we are all different, as I'm sure most of you have noticed. Some are intellectuals, some are not. Some are readers, some are not. Some are deep thinkers, some are not. Some are deeply spiritual, some are more practical. But for all of us, doing nothing is not a viable option. The Bereans, they were all different too, just like we are. But they all studied and put the effort in. It is important for all of us to make the effort, to seek truth, to seek understanding. As I said, we're all different, and how that works out for one person is going to be different to how it works out for another person. But for all of us, there is effort involved. Now, I don't know about you, probably you're not all quite as silly as me, but there have been a couple of occasions in my life, mostly when I was younger, when I decided that I wanted to go up the down escalator. And to go up the down escalator, you've got to put in the effort, or you'll just end up at the bottom. When I did it, I did put in the effort. I got to the top. It worked. It's fine. But you've got to put in the effort, or you don't get there. And it's the same here. All of us, we need to put in the effort. One of my favourite verses of Scripture is from 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 11 in the NIV, which says, "Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always." Not just when you're in trouble and you're desperate. Hey, God, help me. But also when things are great, when you're doing well. Seek God then too. And those days, which is probably most of them, when you're just plodding along and life goes past. Seek God then also. Got to check the time. I've got this block here that I can leave out if we're running out, but I think I've got time to include this. Timothy was a young man added to Paul's team only recently as a disciple, as a learner, and to a certain extent as a servant to serve Paul and Silas. And so 4 men arrived in Philippi. Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke, who'd also joined them along the way. Luke remained to pastor the new church there, and 3 men went on to Thessalonica and Berea. Paul left by sea to travel to Athens. Silas remained in Berea, and Timothy was sent back to Thessalonica. Now, this is something that we do not read about in the book of Acts. It's not mentioned at all. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, it tells us the story of what happened. That Paul was sent off to Athens. Silas was left behind to continue to consolidate the church in Berea. And because they'd had to leave Thessalonica in a hurry, and only been there a short time, Timothy was sent back to Thessalonica to help build up the church there and to see how they were going to be able to report back to Paul. And think about it. Timothy was just a young man, probably early 20s. He'd only been with Paul and Silas a short time, and yet he must have made a deep impression. We don't read of anything that he did, and yet he had created such an impression that Paul was quite happy to entrust him with this significant task by himself, going back to a city that they just had to flee because of trouble. In Acts 18, we read that Silas and Timothy arrived in Corinth, and they reported to Paul all that had gone on, including a report about the church in Thessalonica. And that prompted the writing of a letter by Paul to the church in Thessalonica. And we have that in our Bible as 1 Thessalonians. So a letter went up to Thessalonica, and then reply came back, and then Paul wrote them another letter, which we have in our Bible as 2 Thessalonians. And so that is the context for the writing of the 2 books of Thessalonians, which we have in our scriptures. Moving on. In Acts 18, verses 1 to 3, it says that after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to visit them, and he stayed and worked with them, because they were tent makers by trade, just as he was. So they were Jews. They were already Christians. They had probably come to believe under the preaching of Peter and Mark in Rome. So they'd been Christians for a while, and they were kicked out of Rome. Now, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, around about that sort of time, the Emperor Claudius had issued a decree that all Jews had to leave Rome because of riots at the instigation of someone called Chrestus. Now, we don't know anything more about that, but it is commonly believed that Chrestus was basically, Suetonius didn't quite get his details right, it was actually Christos, and that there were a lot of Jews to become Christians and some non-Jews to become Christians, and there were other Jews who were upset about this and caused quite a stir and disturbed the peace and made a nuisance of themselves, so that the Romans in general were not happy about it, and the Roman emperor was not happy about it, so he said, all right, we'll just get rid of all the Jews, get out. And so they went wherever they went, and Aquila and Priscilla left their home and their business, and they made their way to Corinth. Then going on to verses 18 and 19. Paul remained in Corinth for quite some time before saying goodbye to the brothers. He had his head shaved in Cenchreae to keep a vow he had made. Then he sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. When they reached Ephesus, Paul parted ways with Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and there reasoned with the Jews. So they moved on to Ephesus and set up a home there again and re-established their business, their leatherworking business in Ephesus. And then after Paul had gone, they were still living there in Ephesus and doing their thing. This man named Apollos turned up, and he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him in and explained to him the way of God more accurately. So they obviously already had a solid understanding of the gospel and were able to explain it and to set Apollos right in that aspect. And as we mentioned, Paul then came back to Ephesus, which is chapter 19, which is the future story. And then after his time in Ephesus, he did another quick trip around up to Philippi and then back down to Corinth. And while he was in Corinth that last time, he wrote a letter to the church in Rome telling them how he was hoping to come and visit them. And at the end of Romans, which is the record of that in our Bible, of that letter, there's a whole chapter just about, chapter 16, full of greetings to significant people in the church in Rome. But right at the very start, chapter 16, verses 3 to 5 of Romans, he writes, "Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who have risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. And greet also the church that meets in their house." So it's probably during Paul's time in Ephesus, sometime during that period, that they decided that it's been a few years, it's probably safe to try and go back to Rome. So they moved back to Rome and were able to, I don't know if it was the same home they were in before, if they had to get a new one, but they established their home and re-established their business in Rome. So that's where they were, and they even had a church meeting in their house. Now, that bit about they risked their lives for me, there's no record anywhere of what that involved, so it would have been either during Paul's period in Corinth or during Paul's period in Ephesus prior to them leaving and going to Rome. It may also even have prompted them to leave Ephesus at that time if their lives were in continual danger staying there. So these two were clearly significant people. They were people who, wherever they were, lived out their everyday lives, ran their business, and put God first in everything. Living for God came first. Life and business was subservient to that. So what do you do with your life? Not all of us are called to be apostles like Paul. Not all of us are called to pastor churches. But we are all called to be Jesus wherever we are. To put him first, always. And to trust in him no matter what. And so finally, I have 3 points that I want to leave with you this morning. Number 1, seek truth and understanding daily. 2, look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face, always. And 3, be Jesus wherever you are.